All right, welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating explainer at the intersection of culture, language, and religion. We're going to look at one of the most interesting linguistic phenomena in Western history. Think about this. For centuries, across entirely different nations, entirely different cultures, and wildly varying spoken dialects, one single language dominated the religious life of Western Europe.
Okay, let's dive into this because it's a massive historical paradox, right? Christianity originated in the Middle East, literally miles away from the city of Rome. Yet for over 1,000 years, Latin became the undisputed language of its Western liturgy, theology, and administration. How on earth did a Middle Eastern movement end up speaking the language of the Caesars? Well, let's unpack the historical and practical reasons behind this massive shift.
Part 1. Languages of the Early Church. From ancient temples to the Greco-Roman world.
So to really understand the shift, we have to recognize that Latin was absolutely not the starting point. The early church was incredibly adaptable. There was actually a clear linguistic baton pass happening here. The Old Testament foundation was, of course, rooted in Hebrew. But by the 1st century, daily language had already shifted to Syriac or Aramaic. Then, the Apostolic era adopted Greek, which was the lingua franca of the time. Honestly, it wasn't until the 3rd century that Latin truly took hold in the West.
A perfect piece of historical evidence for this early adaptability is the biblical story of the raising of Jairus' daughter. See, by the time of Christ, the Jewish people had largely lost their everyday use of Hebrew due to the earlier Babylonian captivity. When Jesus spoke to the young girl, he didn't use ancient temple Hebrew. He used the spoken Aramaic of the day, Talitha Kumi. This proves the early movement eagerly and practically adapted to the common spoken word of the people.
Following that exact precedent, early leaders and apostles utilized regional languages to spread their message. They didn't force a single foreign tongue on their new converts. They appointed Greek services for the Greeks, Arabic for the Arabians, and Latin for those in Latin-speaking territories. In fact, over in the Eastern Church, ancient Greek liturgies, like the ones formulated by St. Basil and St. Chrysostom, are literally still used to this very day.
Section 2. The Rise of Latin, the language of an empire.
And this brilliantly illustrates what actually changed in the West. The answer lies in the geopolitical landscape. At its absolute zenith, the Roman Empire ruled most of Europe, along with massive portions of Asia and Africa. Latin was the official language of this vast empire. Wherever the Roman standard was planted, Latin spread right along with it, quickly becoming the prevailing, everyday tongue of the Western world.
Because Latin had become the common language of everyday people in the West, the Church naturally adopted it for public worship. By the 3rd century, this completely organic shift was formalized. Latin was officially adopted as the language of the Western Church. And this also made the distinction between the Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East so much more manifest and clear.
This whole Latin foundation was totally solidified in the late 4th century by a brilliant scholar named St. Jerome. Commissioned to create a definitive text, Jerome translated the scriptures directly from the original Hebrew and Greek into Latin, creating what we now know as the Vulgate. This established a fixed ancient baseline in sacred literature, essentially a text that would deeply connect modern worshippers to antiquity for centuries to come.
But, as we all know, history doesn't just stand still. The Roman Empire eventually crumbled, and as it fell, new vulgar or common languages began to sprout from that parent Latin stock. We're talking about the early versions of French, Italian, and Spanish. This brings us to the ultimate narrative hinge of this explainer. If the early church adapted to the language of the people, why didn't it just abandon Latin when the people stopped speaking it? Why freeze a language in time?
Which brings us to Section 3, the shifting sands of speech, the problem with living languages.
So, the crucial point is this. As the empire dissolved, the church was actually terrified of doctrinal decay. Living languages are just naturally subject to constant change and corruption, right? Words change their meanings over time. A dead language, however, serves as an immutable, unchanging standard. Fixing the language was seen as the absolute best way to protect the doctrine itself from the shifting sands of living tongues.
To really understand this fear, just look at this incredible historical quirk. If you read a 14th century English Bible, you'll actually find the Apostle Paul proudly describing himself as a villain of Jesus Christ. I mean, today that sounds horrific, but centuries ago, villain simply meant a servant. It's the perfect demonstration of how living languages mutate and how those mutations risk insensibly stealing errors into sacred texts and liturgies.
Section 4. 4 reasons for retention.
The pragmatic defense of Latin.
So here's how they pragmatically defended keeping it. First, unity of faith. A uniform language was believed to preserve identical doctrine globally. Second, stability of language, which avoids that villain problem we literally just talked about. Third, universal communication across a massive geographic spread. And fourth, the preservation of antiquity, maintaining a direct linguistic link to early figures like St. Jerome. Together, these four pillars turned what could have just been an archaic rule into a total masterstroke of global unity.
Think about the sheer logistics of that universal communication piece. Historical texts describe the chaos that Latin prevented as a Babel of tongues. For example, at the 1869 Vatican Council, bishops from all over the globe, speaking dozens of different native languages, assembled together. Because they all spoke Latin, they could debate, converse, and legislate smoothly. Without that dead, universal language, a massive international gathering like that would have been practically impossible.
Now, a really common modern assumption is that keeping the service in Latin was some deliberate attempt to keep everyday people ignorant. However, the historical records show the exact opposite intent. Church councils explicitly commanded pastors to expound on the mysteries and to preach sermons in the vulgar or local dialect. The goal was to nourish the faithful with understanding in their own language, while simultaneously keeping the official, sacred ritual locked safely in Latin.
Let's move to Section 5 and see how this builds into a powerful metaphor: the casket and the jewel, protecting the sacred. To explain this whole practice, writers of the time actually used a really brilliant visual metaphor. They compared the relationship between faith and language to a jewel and a casket. The identical, unchanging doctrine is the precious jewel. The stable, ancient Latin language is the casket that houses and protects it. You essentially refuse to disturb the casket to ensure the jewel inside remains completely intact and uncorrupted by culture over millennia.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the deeply personal, emotional benefit to all this uniformity, the ability to cease to be a stranger. The promise of Latin was that a worshiper could travel from Poland to Spain or from France to the Americas, enter any church, and immediately find a familiar, habituated service. Despite the completely foreign culture outside, inside those doors, they were never a stranger.
So the adoption of Latin might have started as an organic accident of empire, but keeping it was a deliberate shield against the chaos of history. And it raises a really fascinating question for us today as we wrap up this explainer. In our rapidly changing, highly fragmented modern world, is there still a profound human need for an unchanging, universal language of the sacred, something that binds us across borders and centuries? It's definitely a question worth pondering. Thanks for learning with us today, and we'll see you in the next one.